Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, if you are not a creator on YouTube, you may not be familiar with some of the interesting information that we have access to as creators on YouTube. And one of them is that you can look at this thing called content your audience watches. And it tells you, okay, the people that are watching your content, what else are they watching in large numbers? And so I can look through videos, shorts, I can look at other channels you guys tend to watch, and that gives me a little bit of a sense of what you might be interested in. And as I was looking at those, I saw a channel I wasn't familiar with. It's called Resyndicated. This video has 300,000 views, but Resyndicated only has 3,700 subscribers. So I thought it might be interesting to take a look at a smaller content creator, maybe shine a light on them. I haven't really looked at his other stuff yet, but I'll put a link in the description. You can go to this original content, check out what else he might have. This one, apparently, though, has caught your attention. So I thought we'd dive into it. Presidential firsts, from Washington to Biden. This might be interesting.
First president of the United States, George Washington has many distinctions. Notably, he was the first and one of only two presidents to go uncontested in a presidential election. Washington...
I think Monroe was the other one? Pretty sure it was James Monroe was the other uncontested president.
Was elected president twice, and both times went uncontested. John Adams was the first president not to be a slave owner. His son, John Quincy Adams, also never owned slaves. They are the only two presidents of the first 12 with this distinction.
Yeah, because you're going to see a pretty steady stream of Virginians. George Washington's from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson's from Virginia. So that's 1 and 3. And then you got James Madison, James Monroe. They're from Virginia. Andrew Jackson is also from the South. So he's a slave owner. And then you get to Martin Van Buren, who was from the North. So, yeah, it's Virginia was the most powerful, the largest state, the most influential, so it makes sense. You're going to have a lot of early presidents from there.
Thomas Jefferson was the first of 20 presidents to also serve as governor. Jefferson served as the second governor of Virginia for 2 years, starting when he was 36.
Yeah, great point. Only 36 years old. People forget how young some of these guys were during the American Revolution. I mean, George Washington was in his 40s. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, these guys are young. They're not 50, 60, 70 years old. Benjamin Franklin was older. A lot of them were not, though. I mean, Alexander Hamilton's like 20 years old when the Revolution starts.
James Madison's mother was still alive by the end of his 8-year presidency, making him the first president with a parent still alive upon leaving office.
Interesting.
Eleanor Rose Conway Madison was 20 when the future president was born.
Now, Abraham Lincoln, I know, this is kind of irrelevant, but his mother died when he was pretty young, but his stepmother was still alive when he was assassinated.
She died in 1829 at age 98. James Monroe was the first of 17 presidents to have previously served as senator.
And there have been a lot of presidents who have been senator, but very rarely do we elect presidents directly from the Senate. In fact, it's only happened a couple of times. John F. Kennedy was in the Senate. Barack Obama was in the Senate. Go back from there, it's pretty rare that you find people going directly from the Senate to... and it's likewise pretty rare for people going right from the House to the presidency. Governor is by far the most common way that people move into the presidency. Early on, Secretary of State was a pretty common thing. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, all of these guys were Secretaries of State.
Quincy Adams was the first president to be photographed. However, he wasn't the first president to be photographed while serving as president.
Jackson.
Adams served from 1825 to 1829. The popular photograph of Adams was taken in 1843, leaving many today to think Adams looked much older while he was serving as president than he actually did.
Yeah, he was back in the House by this point, and that's a pretty rare thing, too, is to see presidents go back into some political office after being president, but he did that. I want to say Andrew Johnson served in the Senate after he was president. Of course, William Howard Taft goes on to be Chief Justice of the U.S. after being president.
With a history marred by violence, duels, and war, it might come as no surprise that Andrew Jackson was the first president to survive an assassination attempt while in office. An unemployed painter tried to shoot Jackson, but his pistol misfired.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? And then Jackson proceeded to attack him with his cane. Jackson did. He fought dozens and dozens and dozens of duels. In fact, I think he had at least one bullet in his body from one of those duels.
The 66-year-old president attacked his would-be assassin with his cane. He only stopped when others intervened. Martin Van Buren is the first and only president to have learned English as a second language.
Dutch.
As his father was descended from the Netherlands, Van Buren grew up speaking Dutch and only learned English once he was in school.
Yeah, remember, at one time New York City was New Netherlands and New Amsterdam. And up that Hudson River Valley, very common to see a lot of Dutch-speaking people, and that included the Van Burens.
There was a photo taken of William Henry Harrison after his inaugural address in 1841, making him the first president to have his photograph taken while in office. However, the photo has since been lost. Thus, the earliest existing photograph of a president in office is of 11th President James K. Polk. John Tyler was the first president to be widowed while in the White House and the first to remarry while in the White House. Letitia Christian Tyler died during Tyler's second year in office. Later that year, he took interest in 22-year-old Julia Gardiner.
Yeah, and the reason I know so much about that is because Julia Gardiner, Gardiner, comes from a prominent family that my wife is also descended from. A guy named Lyon Gardiner, Lyon. We've been to Lyon Gardiner's grave, which is all the way out on the end of Long Island. If you look at a map, there's an island at the end of Long Island. Long Island has like these two spurs that stick out, and then in between that is Gardiner's Island. Still, I believe, privately owned by the family, and my wife's descended from that Gardiner family. And Tyler still has a living grandson as of now. See, he was like 70 years old, and he had children. And then one of his sons had children very late in life. And that's why a guy born in 1790 still has one living grandson. His last two living grandsons up until a couple of years ago were Harrison Tyler and Lyon Gardiner Tyler.
30 years her senior. The couple wed 2 years later during the final months of Tyler's presidency. James K. Polk was the first president to be outlived by a parent, his mother. This would be the case for many later presidents who died in office, but Polk actually lived out his term. He died 2 months after the end of his presidency at age 53. It was likely cholera that killed him.
Cholera that, and we've talked about this in other videos, but if you're new to the channel, cholera may be responsible. The water supply in and around Washington may be responsible for multiple presidential deaths. Very likely could have killed Zachary Taylor. It might be what killed William Henry Harrison. It might be what killed Polk after he left office.
He was also the first president to die before turning 60. Polk came into the White House with gusto and vigor, like his predecessor and mentor Andrew Jackson. But 4 years in the office took a heavy toll.
Drinking the water.
In 1848, Zachary Taylor became the first of 5 presidents to assume office without having been elected to a public office prior.
Let's see if we can figure out who the other ones are. So we know Zachary Taylor would be one. Dwight David Eisenhower, certainly. Grant would be one. Who else has not been elected to any public office prior? Trump. And there's one more that we're missing. Who could it be? Let me think about that for a minute. Maybe it'll come to me.
Even George Washington,
Was it Pierce?
who is primarily known for his role in the War for Independence, had prior experience in Virginia politics. Taylor won the election mainly due to his fame as a national hero during the Mexican-American War. Millard Fillmore was the first president to leave office with his father still alive. Furthermore, his father, Nathaniel Fillmore, was vibrant and healthy, even as he approached 80 years.
Wow.
When he visited the White House, other guests were astonished by how he looked so close in age to the president.
Jeez.
Nathaniel eventually died at 91,
That's cool.
10 years after his son left office. Franklin Pierce delivered his inaugural address from memory, being the first president to do so rather than reading it. This alone was impressive, but perhaps even more so as Pierce was still devastated by the death of his son only months earlier. Though often considered one of the worst and sometimes the single worst president, Pierce's ability as a charismatic statesman is unquestioned.
Yeah, Pierce's performance as president, I say this all the time, is not because he wasn't capable. It's not because he wasn't intelligent. It's not because he wasn't charismatic. He had all the tools. He had a couple of things that were going against him. Number one, obviously, right as he takes office, he's lost his son in this horrible train accident where he basically was decapitated right in front of his parents, and just brutal thing for any parent to go through, especially when it was I think their only living child at that point. His alcoholism then gets the best of him, and he basically drinks himself into a stupor. He's also a president in that time period leading up to the American Civil War, where anyone less than an exceptional leader was probably going to fail. I think circumstances being different in another time and place, Pierce could have been very effective.
James Buchanan was the first president to be born in Pennsylvania. For over a century and a half, he was the only president from the state until 46th President Joe Biden.
Isn't it interesting that the only two presidents we've ever had that were from Pennsylvania had the same initials, JB?
Assumed the office in 2020. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to have a full beard while in office. Following his vice president, Andrew Johnson, his next three Republican successors, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and James A. Garfield, would also have full beards.
As would Benjamin Harrison, though Benjamin Harrison comes after Chester Arthur, but also the first Republican president.
While James Monroe was the first president to serve in the Senate prior to becoming president, Andrew Johnson was the first to serve after being president.
Yep.
Thus far, no other president has done so. Ulysses S. Grant was the first president to allow for the creation of a national park by the act of dedication, thus creating Yellowstone National Park. Grant had a love of nature since his youth, being an avid outdoorsman and horse rider. During Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency, the White House had its first telephone installed.
Nice.
Hayes is often quoted as saying of the telephone, quote, "It's a great invention, but who would ever want to use one?"
And the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell was the year that Hayes was elected president, 1876, I think. It was around that time.
Even 44th President Barack Obama quoted Hayes as saying this during a speech. According to historians, however, Hayes never made this statement.
Really?
He was actually very enthusiastic about new technologies. He even had Thomas Edison visit the White House during his presidency and show off one of his new inventions. James A. Garfield was ambidextrous and the first left-handed president, or at least the first known left-handed president. In contrast with the previous century, the 20th century saw many left-handed presidents, such as Harry S. Truman, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton. Chester...
Yeah, and not only left-handed or ambidextrous, but it was said he could write in Latin and Greek at the same time. He could write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time, which is just something quirky about how his brain worked.
A. Arthur was the first president to have an elevator installed in the White House. While he wasn't the first president to be married while serving as president, Grover Cleveland was the first to get married in the White House. Going into his presidency, Cleveland was a bachelor. He was also the first president to have a child born in the White House.
Baby Ruth.
Benjamin.
Her name was Ruth. Frances Folsom was his wife that he married in the White House, much younger than him. He had known her since she was a little girl, which was a little weird to a lot of people. But yeah, their daughter Ruth was born in... Baby Ruth, the candy bar, that kind of thing.
Harrison was the first president to have a lighted Christmas tree in the White House. Harrison notoriously hated the presidency, often quitting work days at noon. Upon the end of his term, he said he felt as though he were being freed from prison. He much preferred spending time with his children, who lived at the White House along with their children. During Christmas, he would dress up as Santa Claus and spoil his grandchildren with gifts.
So that's cool, but I would also add first, and to this date, only grandson of a president to be elected president. His grandfather was William Henry Harrison. His father was John Scott Harrison, who was a congressman from Ohio, I think, and very famously had his body snatched after he had died. And it was his son Benjamin who was part of a group that was looking for the body and found him like hanging on a meat hook or something, which is horrifying.
He would dress up as Santa Claus and spoil his grandchildren with gifts. William McKinley was the first president to ride in an automobile. It was a steam-powered automobile invented by O.F. Stanley, and very different from the cars of today. McKinley's ride wasn't an enjoyable one. He felt as though, at best, the driver would lose control, or at worst, the vehicle would explode on its bumpy ride. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to be wounded by an assassin after serving as president. In October 1912, Roosevelt was campaigning for an unprecedented third term when he was struck by a single bullet fired by a mentally ill man. The bullet lodged in Roosevelt's chest muscles. It was slowed down after passing through a steel eyeglasses case and a copy of a speech. As he wasn't coughing blood, Roosevelt correctly concluded that the bullet hadn't reached his lung. Therefore, he asked the police to take away the would-be assassin, but not to do him any harm. Then he began and finished an entire speech before receiving medical attention.
The single most insane story of a president ever. And I love it. Guy got shot and then turned around and finished the speech. And it wasn't a short speech either. It was a long speech, which is probably why it slowed the bullet down. But not only that, that's just one of many insane stories with him. My personal favorite, though, with Theodore Roosevelt is the time he's out west. And I tell this one a lot because I love it so much. And somebody steals his boat. And so he makes another boat, catches up with the guys, captures them, and takes them back to face justice. Insane. Went boxing in the White House, lost the sight in one eye in a boxing match. Crazy stuff.
William Howard Taft was the first president to have also served on the Supreme Court. In 1921, 8 years after leaving office, Taft became the court's Chief Justice. Despite the presidency being the more highly acclaimed office, serving on the Supreme Court was actually Taft's lifelong dream.
Yeah, that's what he preferred, was to be on the Supreme Court. Now, there have been Supreme Court justices that have run for president, but there's never been somebody else who has served as both.
Woodrow Wilson is actually the first president to be buried in Washington, D.C. He remains the only president buried in the district.
Yeah, he's buried in the National Cathedral in D.C. And a lot of people say, well, what about William Howard Taft and John F. Kennedy? But they're buried in Arlington, which used to be a part of the District of Columbia, but isn't anymore. It hasn't been for a long, long, long time. So they're buried in Virginia.
In 1923, Warren G. Harding became the first president to die before his father. He passed unexpectedly during the third year of his term due to a heart attack.
I mean, I knew he died in office, but it surprises me that he's the first president to die before his father.
The first radio broadcast from the White House was given by Calvin Coolidge in 1924. It was a tribute to his predecessor, Warren G. Harding.
Fascinating to me that the guy who's known as Silent Cal, who was known for being a man of few words, would be the first president to give a radio address.
Harding was actually the first to have his voice broadcast on the radio, but Coolidge would make excessive use of the technology during his 6 years. The iconic image of the phone at the president's desk began with Herbert Hoover. While President Hayes was the first to have a telephone installed in the White House, Hoover was the first to have a phone on the president's desk. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first president who traveled via airplane while serving as president. Prior to this, it was actually considered unsafe for a president to fly on an airplane, though Roosevelt would make extensive use of flight during his 12-year presidency, allowing him to visit Haiti, Iran, and the Soviet Union. He was also the first president to visit each of these nations. Ironically, Roosevelt's fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, had been the first president to fly via any aircraft, though this was after his presidency.
And interesting to note, well, not only they were fifth cousins, they were distantly related, but much more closely related through Franklin's wife, who was Theodore Roosevelt's niece, his brother's daughter. And but it's interesting to think about Theodore Roosevelt being the first person to serve in the office of president to fly in an airplane, because his son, very famously, is shot down and killed as a pilot in the First World War.
Harry S. Truman was the first president to visit Germany. After the surrender of the Nazis, Truman met with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill in Ally-occupied territory. Hawaii and Alaska were only admitted into the Union in 1959. Thus, Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president to govern all 50 states. Along with Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy was the first president to compete in a live televised presidential debate. In prior elections, presidential debates weren't standard practice. In the 1940 election, Franklin Roosevelt's Republican rival, Wendell Willkie, proposed the idea of a radio broadcasted debate, but Roosevelt declined. Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Dan, I don't believe that there was another presidential debate for several elections after that one. It took a while before it became a regular thing that we take for granted now.
Johnson was the first president to appoint an African American to the Supreme Court. With the appointment of Thurgood Marshall, Johnson remarked that he, quote, deserves the appointment. I believe it is the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place.
And you got to give a ton of credit. Listen, for all of LBJ's failings, and he was hardly perfect. None of these guys are perfect, but think about this. A Southern Democrat who, as a senator, had been very critical of the civil rights movement and had opposed civil rights legislation, ends up being the first guy to appoint a black man to the Supreme Court. Incredible that that happened.
2 other African-American judges have since served on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Richard Nixon was the first vice president to be elected to the office of president without being the incumbent vice president. When John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Martin Van Buren were elected president, they were serving as vice president for the current administration. Nixon served as vice president for Dwight Eisenhower from 1953 to 1961. He did run in the election of 1960, but lost to Kennedy.
Maybe.
He would finally win the presidency for himself in 1968.
Yeah, and he had actually run for governor of California, I think in 66, and lost that, and kind of thought his political career was over, and then had this opportunity come about in 68.
Gerald Ford was the first and only president to never be elected to the office. Some presidents, such as John Tyler and Andrew Johnson,
never be elected to the office of either president or vice president.
Only assumed the office after the death of their predecessor and would never win an election of their own. However, they were on the presidential ticket as vice president. When Nixon was running for re-election in 1972, his running mate was Spiro Agnew. Agnew resigned early in Nixon's second term, and it was only then that Nixon made Ford his new vice president. Prior to this position, Ford was serving as House Minority Leader. Jimmy Carter was the first president to use his nickname rather than his real name, James Earl Carter Jr., in an official capacity. Carter signed documents using his nickname and even used it while taking the oath of office.
Did not know that.
In 1981, Ronald Reagan became the first president to survive an assassination attempt in office despite being wounded. A bullet which hit Reagan in his underarm broke his rib and punctured his lung, causing internal bleeding. It's believed that it was only for the quick thinking of a Secret Service agent, Jerry Parr, that Ronald Reagan survived.
Yeah, the bullet that hit him actually ricocheted off the door and into his chest, and it was much more serious than people realized. And also interesting that Ronald Reagan breaks a century-and-a-half long streak of presidents elected in years ending in 0 dying in office. Going all the way back to the 1840 election, you had William Henry Harrison dies in office. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, dies in office. 1880, James Garfield dies in office. 1900, McKinley dies in office. 1920, Warren Harding dies in office. 1940, Franklin Roosevelt dies in office. 1960, John F. Kennedy dies in office. 1980, Ronald Reagan breaks that streak. And then in 2000, you have George W. Bush get elected, and he actually had a assassination attempt. Not a lot of people talk about this, but somebody actually threw a grenade up on a platform that he was on, and thankfully was not hurt by that.
George H.W. Bush was the first president to have previously served as acting president. In this role, the president passes presidential power to the vice president for a limited period of time. Bush served as acting president for 8 hours while Ronald Reagan underwent colon cancer surgery. Bill Clinton was the first president to send an email. He didn't use digital communication often, however, preferring face-to-face interactions. George W. Bush was the first president to leave office with both his parents alive. George Bush Sr. and Barbara Bush lived through their son's 8 years, Barack Obama's 2 terms, and died during Donald Trump's term in 2018.
And interesting, too, to note that George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump were all born the same summer of 1946. Kind of a crazy thing.
Both were in their 90s. The official presidential portrait of Barack Obama, taken in 2009, was taken with a digital camera, making him the first president with this distinction.
That's cool.
Donald Trump is the first president to have assumed office without having ever been elected to a political office, held a public office, or have military experience. Other presidents, such as Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, had never previously been elected, but were military generals. Herbert Hoover hadn't previously been elected, but served in the administrations of Woodrow Wilson and Calvin Coolidge. Joe Biden is the first president to have served as a senator for over 35 years. The president with the second most years in the Senate, Lyndon B. Johnson, served 12.
Wow.
To support regular upload.
That's cool. That was a good video, so I enjoyed that a lot. Put the link down in the description if you want to check him out. I don't know anything else about what his other videos are, but if there's some good stuff there, we'll probably dive into some more at some point. So check it out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.